Welcome to the second lecture in the frame of the North Pontic and Southeast Balkan lecture series of ARVA. It is a great pleasure to me to introduce you today's speaker, Dr. Udo Schlotzhauer from the Eurasia department of the German Archaeological Institute in Berlin. Udo studied at the University of Bochum, where he graduated as Magister Artium in 1996. He also completed his doctorate there in 2001 under the supervision of Professor Volkmar von Grebe with a dissertation entitled Die südionischen Knickrandschalen, eine chronologische Untersuchung zu den sogenannten ionischen Schalen in Milet. In English, the South Ionian Cups with inverted rim, a chronological study of the so-called Ionian Cups in Miletus. He then changed to the Johannes Gutenberg University in Mainz, turning to a new field of activity. There, from 2001 to 2004, he was research assistant in the Naucratis project of the Collaborative Research Center, in German Sonderforschungsbereich, with the title Cultural and Linguistic Contexts. In 2005, he changed again, not only his place of work, but also his study region. He moved to Berlin, where he became scientific consultant at the German Archaeological Institute, namely for the classical archaeology of the northern Black Sea region. I wish I had prepared a map with all the places Udo has conducted research, because his involvements and activities are impressive. Already during his studies, he took part in the projects of the German Miletus excavation in Western Turkey, and that's where we met for the first time, and I checked, it was back in 1994. In Miletus, he acted since 1997 and until 2001, also as an excavation assistant. Further research periods and collaborative excavation projects took him to the Heraion in Samos and to the Selinont excavation in Sicily. As scientific consultant in the Eurasia department, he then led the research on the Taman Peninsula in southern Russia, together with Denis Shuravlev from the State Historical Museum in Moscow. The emphasis of their joint research was on landscape archaeology, on exemplary excavations in various settlements, and on object analysis, whereby multidisciplinary approaches were, as is standard in Udo's research, always pursued. His diverse activities and interests have led to a variety of publications and editorships, of which at least the following should be highlighted. For the Ionian research, apart from his already mentioned PhD, the study from 2005, written together with Michael Kashner, entitled A New Classification System of East Greek Pottery. Then the fundamental essay from 2007 on the relationship between the so-called animal frieze and picadura styles in Miletus. And in print is an important study carried out together with Hans Mommsen called A New Home for the Caryatian Hydrie in a South Ionian Workshop. Related to the Naucratis project and the Egyptian-Greek contacts, one has to mention the two edited volumes, one from 2006 in collaboration with Alexandra Willing, called Greek Diversity in Egypt, Studies on East Greek Pottery and Exchange in the Eastern Mediterranean, and the second volume, edited together with Sabine Weber in 2012, on Greek pottery of the 7th and 6th century from Naucratis and other sites in Egypt. This one is published in German language. Turning to the Pontic region, I would like to mention especially the study from 2013 related to the research in the ancient settlement Golubitskaya II on the southern Russian Taman Peninsula, and the study with several co-authors published in 2014 on local pottery workshops of the northern Pontus. As can be seen from these publications, the broad cultural contact is one of Udo's consistent research topics, and I'm sure it is of great importance also in his today's talk entitled Early Greek Contacts in the Western and Northern Pontic region. Please, Udo, the screen is now yours.
Thank you very much, Agathe. Thank you for the nice words. And I also want to thank the organizers for inviting me and to give you a brief presentation on this online event, which is dedicated to the Northern Pontus and Southeastern European Balkans. I hope I will focus on this theme. So now I have to share with you the PowerPoint. Could everybody see?
Yes.
but we are not in the beginning.
Okay.
Why ever? So here we are. When I was asked what I thought would be suitable for a lecture from the perspective of classical archaeology, I immediately suggested the topic given here. And there are several good reasons why this topic was chosen, I think. On the one hand, there's a super-regional aspect which unfortunately threatens to be lost from the scholarly focus in the ongoing conflict. In other words, in Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine and its simultaneous demands on the neighboring countries. In this sense, it is certainly important not to lose the focus on this supra-regional topic and to remain in dialogue about it within the scientific community. On the other hand, for the foreseeable future, unfortunately, the war will prevent us from continuing to work on certain topics in this field. But in the years before the terrible attack, a number of outstanding new finds were made. These brought minor and major surprises and shed new light on the questions of the first Greek contacts in Western and Northern Pontus. Finally, I would also like to mention another reason for the choice of the topic. There is a great deal of disagreement in the interpretation of the features and artifacts found. That is what makes the topic so exciting, and I hope not only from my point of view. I therefore invite you to accompany me now on this exciting and controversial topic. Okay. The Black Sea, which was still referred by the Greeks as Pontus Axainos, the inhospitable sea, during the period of the earliest Greek contact discussed here, had some special characteristics in the wider context of the so-called Greek colonization movement. One of these special features was a delayed expansion into this northeastern region. Another seems to be the fact that the first contact of the Greeks within the region of the Black Sea does not start on his shores, it seems, but deep, or even better, much deeper in the hinterland, partly 500 to 600 kilometers behind the coastline. This already addresses two of the major problems that are still unresolved and will be discussed in the following. However, I would like to make clear right in advance that I will limit myself to the earliest period, namely the second half of the 7th century BC, and will only look beyond this boundary into the 6th century BC in specific cases. However, this also means that I will not go into the period after the early colonization, a time recently described by Jochen Fornasier as the consolidation phase. He dates this phase in which an expansion phase becomes visible in the Apoikiae in Western and Northern Pontus, such as Histria, Olbia, and also in Phanagoria, be it fortification, sanctuaries, and so on. He dates this phase from 580 BC to the third quarter of the 6th century BC. Quite correct, as I mean. But this will not be my task today. However, no, to go back. So einfach. However, first let's look in a broader context of Greek colonization. Much has been said about the first Greeks in the West in recent decades, and this discussion still continues. However, the different views are still in many points in contrast, be it in terms of terminology, in terms of the process of the groups involved, their share of trade in the period prior to the foundation of the first colonies, or the colonization process itself. Without going into detail on individual positions, the following statements can certainly be regarded as secured or reasonably secured, which seems important to us in terms of the process in the Black Sea. The inhabitants of Greece have been in contact with the West for centuries. This is reflected not only by imports from Mycenaean Greece in Sicily, Italy, and Spain, but also locally produced Mycenaean pottery, like here on the left down. The trade, especially metals, as the main engine of this context is well known. Other reasons are also discussed. Mycenaean Greeks had already settled in areas with later Greek settlements in Sicily, southern Italy, and Sardinia. However, it is already controversial to what extent, and if so, how long this contact was interrupted in the so-called Dark Ages. So, whether the post-Mycenaean Greeks could in any ways directly or indirectly tie in with older contacts or older knowledges or not. Nevertheless, there is no doubt that even before the first temporary settlements of Greeks in Pithecusae and later on from here to Cumae, around the middle of the 8th century BC, Greeks were involved in a Phoenician-dominated older trade network from the eastern to the western Mediterranean. In the late 9th and the first half of the 8th century BC, Euboean PSC scyphoi and chevron scyphoi of Euboean type of the Middle Geometric and Late Geometric I time reached Italy and Sardinia. It does not matter whether the Greek imports found in Italy and Sardinia were transported by the Greeks themselves, or whether the Greeks traveled with the Phoenicians, or whether the merchants were non-Greeks. The discovered materials show that the Greek learned about places in the West that reached their products and from where goods, by whom or ever, came back. How different, however, were the conditions in the Black Sea? There was not the slightest sign of a Bronze Age connection with the Mycenaean Greeks here. There is also no evidence for this and the later time for a trade network over the sea. No Phoenicians and other sea people could be detected in the Pontus, unless that we do not recognize them, a possibility that always remains. The history of the Black Sea colonization begins in the Hellespont. This is the access to the Black Sea. Ionians from Asia Minor, some of the earliest Milesian colonies in the Hellespont are marked here with blue dots. And Greeks from Megara, as an example, I have only marked Chalcedon on the Asian bank of the Thracian Bosporus with a green dot. Start to colonize this area from the late 8th century BC or the early 7th. The ancient written records differ from archaeological dating. I will not go into detail about this, nor about the settlement dynamic that subsequently developed in the forecourt of the Black Sea. Furthermore, we exclude the controversial and rather unlikely foundation dates given by Skymnos for Sinope and Eusebius for Trapezuum on the south coast of the Black Sea. They gave the middle of the 8th century BC, a time in which Pithecusae was founded and far before the foundations in the Hellespont. This would require a separate discussion. Beyond this, the Black Sea was not colonized before the last third of the 7th century BC. The reasons for the late penetration into the Pontus or Xynos unfortunately remain in the dark. Thus, two major differences to Western colonization, or a peculiarity of Black Sea colonization in the context of Greek colonization, have already been mentioned now. The relatively late time at which colonization begins here, and the absence of older contacts before the 7th century BC. The question remains why the shores of the Black Sea obviously stay from colonization for so long. If trade was the engine for contacts, which is conventionally adopted in the Mediterranean for the colonization of the East and the West, it must be concluded that the population of the Black Sea were not interested in trade, or that the coast was reasonably deserted. But the Greeks were not quite as inactive in the Pontus by the time when they had laid out the colonies in the Propontis. The first traces of this activity roots at this time far into the hinterland of the northern Pontus. Approximately 400 kilometers away from the coast, Nemirov, Tractemirov, and Belskoye are located in the forest steppe and probably could only be reached via the large rivers Bug, Dnieper, and their tributaries. The fact that Nemirov was a large and powerful central place, which had particularly extensive trade relations in all directions, was excellently proved by Kashuba and Vahtina. Powerful central places in about 400-kilometer distance to the shore of the Black Sea, with extensive contacts or commercial networks, offer the oldest Greek pottery ever found in a region associated with the Black Sea. It is likely, in the absence of other actors in the Pontus, that it was the Greeks themselves who learned about these places and found their way to them. Of course, it is also impossible to rule out that the impulse was also the other way around, and members of these central places or indigenous traders sought contact with the Greeks. However, much speaks for the Greeks themselves as carrier, since the trips over the Black Sea and through the rivers were rather close to the seafaring people. Of course, this reconstruction cannot be completely proven. It is only probable. In this time and in this area, however, only the Greeks were known as such. We are also quite well informed where the earliest vases were produced, namely in Teos in northern Ionia, in Miletus and Samos in South Ionia. In other words, the same actors who were already active in the Hellespont. But this says nothing about the carriers. Under the slogan "Pots, not people," it has been warned several times to infer from imports to the origin of the dealers or to draw conclusions about the consumer. But in our context, in the period of early contact and throughout the early colonization process of the Black Sea, the ancient written sources and archaeology confirms themselves. It is mainly East Greek material originating from Ionia. From this, we can conclude that Ionians were the Greeks who were very interested and involved in these contacts. We cannot get any closer to them. Another question is, for whatever reason Greeks or other actors have made this effort. Neither archaeology nor written sources provide any information. Discussed is trade, but also gift exchange. We are not sure on this point. Both seems possible. But as we will see, contacts increase with the time and expands over large areas. Therefore, it is quite possible that both can be true and change from one to another over time. There's still some controversy surrounding the dating of the earliest finds that determine the date of contact and the duration of this contact. This is mainly due to the fact that both the relative and particularly the absolute chronology of East Greek pottery is characterized by a number of uncertainties. Nevertheless, one of the earliest of all finds seemed for long to be a bird cotyle from Tractemirov. Even Kershner dated the fragment in 2006 in the first quarter of the 7th century. Recently, however, new documentations of the object have shown that its shape is not that of a cotyle, but rather the earliest bird bowl. Kershner himself changed his previous classification, which he had created due to a bad photo. Equipped with a sketch, you see it here, of the profile and better photos, it now turns out that it's more closely related to the bird bowls found in Nemirov and Belsk, as previously thought. The Nemirov bird bowl is classified by Kerschner to type 2 and 3, and likewise dated in the second quarter or a little bit later of the 7th century BC. Therefore, the first documented contact in Takhtamirov must be corrected from the first quarter of the 7th century to the second, or if we take the latest probability, around the middle or shortly after the middle of the century. Here we are already in the middle of one of the most controversial topics. To make a long story short, Eastern Greek pottery becomes the key witness for various theories on the reconstruction of the earliest Greek contacts into the Black Sea. The high dating of the supposed bird cortule can now be considered outdated. What remains is the question of whether the Greek artifacts found in the interior should really be dated earlier than those in the late Apoikia, such as Histria, Berezan, or Taganrog, or whether they should be dated at roughly the same time. Even if the date does not longer coincide with the time shortly after the first colonial foundation in the Propontis, we cannot agree with those scholars who date all the early pottery in the Black Sea, including the Nemirov, Belsk, and Takhtamirov bird bowls in the same period, namely the last quarter of the 7th century BC, as was the case in several recent articles. Such a date would mean one would have to completely ignore the development of East Greek ceramics and waste painting over 3/4 of a century and squeeze it into a quarter of a century. Another tendency aims in the opposite direction. Among the finds from the earliest sites on the banks of the North Pontus, near the large estuaries, some scholars have discovered pottery that is older than previously known. Alabruski, for example, was able to cite both bowls with inverted rim from South Ionia and wild goat style pottery from Berezan at the mouth of the Bug and Dnieper rivers, which are stylistically similar to the oldest finds in Nemirov and Takhtamirov. Just compare the image of the dogs on a Milesian amphora in Nemirov and the dog's head on a fragment from Berezan. There are other similarities that should suggest the same workshop and thus more or less the same date. In this way, the so-called pre-colonial contact in the Black Sea region no longer appears to be a suitable model. For the dates of these earliest Greek objects in context of the indigenous population would no longer be older than those on the coast and find places such as Histria or Game or Berezan and Taganrog. On the other hand, the earliest pottery on the coast may be older than previously assumed. As a result, the distance to the finds on the coasts of the western and northern Pontus, which can now be dated earlier, is reduced in such a way that with the current accuracy, or rather inaccuracy, no decision can be made as to whether the objects arrived at the same time or reached the hinterland or the coastal region first. Of course, it seems obvious that the finds reached the hinterland traveling through the estuaries of the large rivers. So the oldest finds here should be at least as old as those inland. This finding would also weaken other assumptions that the earliest Greek artifacts reached the large settlements of the forest steppe overland in the west, which was last proposed by Marina Vachtina. In Nemirov, there is more. A cup with inverted rim could be dated also already in the third quarter of the 7th century BC. From the same quarter of the century, there are also oinochoe and table amphora with wild goat decoration. Therefore, the date of the earliest Greek pottery finds in the forest steppes in the northern hinterland of the northern coast of the Black Sea is roughly at the same time. Wachtina and Kerschner also carried out provenance studies on the pottery's clay at Hans Mommsen's laboratory in Bonn. The majority of the wild goat style pottery was not surprisingly found to be Milesian. Even so, the shape of the amphora from Nemirov was previously unknown for Miletus. The cup with inverted rim of type 5 in the classification of Schlotzhauer, on the other hand, this is the cup you see here up on the left, turned out to be Samian. But also North Ionian wild goat style pottery reached the forest steppe far inland. In the following period, the region of the forest steppe and the steppe between Bug and Dnieper remain in contact with the Greek until even after the founding of the colonies on the shores of the Black Sea, as indicated by the Greek finds in the region. In addition, the contact zone expands enormously over time. Therefore, it can be assumed that the contact was more or less peaceful and successful, because it was certain sustainability. For the same reason, it must have been profitable. Otherwise, you would hardly have taken the strain on hundreds of kilometers against the current to drive and overcome some obstacles such as rapids. To point out again, the periphery was obviously the main destination for the first contact, probably between Ionians and indigenous, and took place simultaneously to the shores where later colonies were established. In the period predating the colonies, Greek pottery could not be found on the coast before the middle of the 7th century BC. Again, they were found in indigenous contexts in kurgans, like in Orgame, near the mouth of the Danube, in Kiebrüki, at the Dniester, and in Temigora on the Crimea. These are most likely the areas where in the 7th century BC indigenous peoples supposed to be. Large parts of the coast in the northern Black Sea seems not populated. For the areas in which Berezan Olbia was later founded, or for the Cimmerian Bosporus, investigations have already been carried out, which seems to confirm this assumption. However, the three sites described here with early Greek artifacts in kurgans, presumably belonging to local elites on the Danube, the Dniester, and the Cimmerian Bosporus, the latter of which was regarded by the Greeks as both the mouth of the Don and the mouth of the Kuban, have further common features. A comparison of the painters clearly show the closest connections. The composition of the decoration, the ornaments, and also the style of the figures are partly identical. Just compare the dividing friezes or the figures such as the dogs, goats, deers, and the frieze on the fragment you see here on the upper part, and those here from Temigora on the Crimea. Another more recent result is interesting in addition to Milesian wild goat style pottery. The method of neutron activation analysis was also able to identify cups with inverted rim produced on the neighboring island of Samos, both in Nemirov in the hinterland and on the coast, most probably in Orgame and Berezan. The cup with inverted rim are mainly of type 5 according to my classification. The fact that the cup in Orgame and Berezan also originate from Samian production, even though they were not analyzed, is almost certain thanks to the results of Tagan rock. Let us look further east into the region of the Cimmerian Bosporus, the Sea of Azov, and its hinterland on the northern edge of the Caucasus, where the Don and especially the Kuban and its tributaries open up the hinterland. Even in the older literature, the regions providing the earliest Greek pottery was divided into regions. the Dnieper Bug and the Don region. Zetzglatze added a third region, the Cimmerian Bosporus, with the Kuban area. However, new finds raised doubts about these separations. Similar early finds to those further west have now been discovered both at the coastal estuaries and far inland. But we will start with an already well-known find from the Temigora Kurgan. This early Milesian broad round-mouthed oinochur was found here on the Kerch Peninsula in a context attributed to the local elite. Even so, indigenous settlements from this period are unknown in the vicinity. It belongs to the Milesian Archaic 1b phase according to the classification of Schlotzhauer and Kerschner for Eastern Greek pottery, and it could be dated around 640–30. Like the earliest pottery in the forest steppe in the north, for a long time, this early Ionian evidence was considered isolated in the Cimmerian Bosporus. As we will now see, this is not longer true. Mainly because of the discovery of a fragment of a bird bowl in Alexeyevka, close to the modern seaside resort Anapa in the 1970s, it seemed to be earlier than the pottery in the colonies at the Cimmerian Bosporus. But for the Cimmerian Bosporus and the Kuban region, the picture changed dramatically in the last years. The area has brought a great deal of new information to light. The bird bowl in Alexeyevka is now far from being alone. Sudarev and others have found in recent surveys and excavation in Subspech near Alexeyevka wild-caught pottery from Ionia going back in time not far from the bird bowl. But we still have no clear idea of the context of these early discoveries. Even so, the excavator recently announced that the finds came from a settlement and a necropolis area. But was it a Greek apoikia or a local settlement? Up to now, we don't know. Furthermore, investigations by Tolstikov have unearthed a great amount of early pottery in Pontic. In the last years, published from 2007 till now. Thus, this place is verified now as the earliest colony at the Cimmerian Bosporus and coming close in time with Olbia and the settlement at Taganrog on Don, at least in the 620–10 BC. Here we find now the same wares and painted pottery like in the mentioned other early colonies. We do not want to argue over a decade sooner or later. In any case, comparison of the pottery show that the finds in Pantikapayon are not inferior to the earliest finds in Suspech or in Taganrog settlement. They are at least as old as those. The studies on paleography on the Taman Peninsula undertaken by Brückner and Kelterbaum have revealed a reconstruction of the geography for antiquity and have reconstructed the change over time. The area has undergone profound upheavals and is still in flux, as is the case with all estuaries and regions with a high tectonics. As a result, we see on the one hand that the position of the entrance of the Kuban River, the ancient Antikythus, has changed and lay much further to the east, and on the other, that the strategic position of both Pantikapayon and the area of Alexeyevka and Suspech have changed. But what is about the hinterland of this region? For a long time, it seems as if there were no early finds in the region comparable to those in Nemirov and Tahtemirov. With the later dating of the finds there to the third quarter of the 7th century BC, the dating of the known pottery at the Kuban and even behind the Kuban is no longer so far from one another. Obviously, there was a stimulus at nearly the same time as it obviously existed in the northern forest steppe with the local indigenous central places. Particularly noteworthy is a find that was excavated in up to 500 to 600 kilometers in distance from the seashore, already beyond the course of the Kuban and its tributaries. Novozavidanoi. Here, East Greek finds, especially drinking vessels, appear in local kurgans shortly after the middle of the third quarter of the 7th century BC. And again, the oldest finds are not found on the coast, but again in the hinterland. There was found a dish from South Ionian Miletos and fragments of an oinochoe from North Ionian Klazomenai, which Maslov has published. The production centers in Miletos and Klazomenai are confirmed by archaeometric investigations in the laboratory of Hans Mommsen in Bonn. These finds are at about the same time as the finds that can be found in the earliest foundation at the mouth of the relevant rivers at the seashores. So this is new. Before we thought it's older than the finds on the seashore, but with Pantikapayon and Suspech, this picture changed dramatically. The point of departure may actually have been only the mouth of the Kuban, the ancient Antikythus. The oinochoe from Klazomenai and the dish from Miletos belong to the period around 630, 620. Recently, this approach was even outbid by new discoveries. In Krasnye, much closer to the mouth of the Antikythus Kuban, about 40 kilometers from the mouth at that time, Greek finds of the middle or the third quarter of the 7th century BC recently were uncovered. Also in a proto-Maiotic kurgan of the Scythian period. The preservation of the jugs with round mouths is very bad, but the drawings from the publication by Shevchenko allow the decoration to appreciate well and coincide with our observations on the originals in the museum in Krasnodar. It is probably a Milesian and a North Ionian product, a similar arranging as in the other places. These spectacular finds are very close in time to the round-mouthed oinochoe from Temigora kurgan, and they finally release them from their previously assumed isolation. Once again, at a considerable distance from the estuary, there is a third locality with Greek imports, Tarasova Balka, on a tributary of the Kuban, which comes down from the Caucasus. It is located in the border area of the modern region of Krasnodar and Adygir, distant 300 kilometers from the estuary of the Kuban into the Black Sea. The hitherto known and published finds by Rybkova are certainly only a little younger than those previously discussed, probably also around 620. It belongs to the Milesian Archaic 1C phase according to the classification of Schlotzhauer and Kerschner for East Greek pottery. In recent time, there are more finds along the Kuban between modern city of Krasnodar and the estuary, like Marayanskaya, where a preliminary publication submitted Wildkop pottery, at least from the beginning of the 6th century BC. Finally, let's take a quick look at the region at the Don and its tributaries. Here the findings are still slightly sparsely than in the Kuban region. The starting point for the finds in the hinterland must have been the settlement at Taganrog. The bird bowls which were connected with the Taganrog settlement and further material like cups with inverted rim of type 5 from the excavation of Otvindali belongs to the last quarter of the 6th century BC. There's more material from Taganrog we're waiting for. From here, Ionian pottery from the 7th century BC found again its way towards the east and northeast via the Don and its tributaries. The well-known Onohoe from Boltiška has to be dated to 640-30. It is again a Milesian, broad, round-mouthed Onohoe, stylistically again belonging to the phase Milesian Archaic 1b. The well-known Onohoe from Boltiška has to be dated, as I told, to 640-30. It is again stylistically very close to finds from the forest steppe. So you have here the comparison with the Nemirov fragment, and you see the docks are stylistically very close, and also the filling ornaments are close in both on both fragments. That means that they are also chronologically and stylistically very close. The most unusual finds are two Milesian Oinohoe with zoomorphic spouts in the shape of a ram and a panther. Unfortunately, I only have a photo of the ram-headed fragment from Krivorochye. Such a high-quality example is still missing in Miletus itself until today. Only 3 examples are known. Apart from the 2 here east of the Azov Sea, we know of only 1 more complete example, which was found on the island of Chios. These exceptional pieces were long thought to be Chian. But a provenance study carried out again by Hans Mommsen in Bonn proved that they were produced in Miletus. Here is a compilation of the sites discussed now. Also, these are not all known sites, but they are the most significant. They now provide a reliable picture of the earliest Greek finds in the Black Sea. In other words, the picture of the 7th century BC. As some may have noticed, it is a different picture from the one I have painted in previous lectures. New ideas contributed by colleagues, but above all, new finds, especially those from Phanagoria, but also newly discovered finds from Berezan and Olbia, allow us to open a new chapter in the reconstruction of early Greek remains in the Black Sea. To summarize briefly once again, the Black Sea played a particular role in the Greek migration. It begins with the fact that the Greeks were late in penetrating the Black Sea compared to the West. While the colonization of the Hellespont could still fit into the chronology of the West, the earliest Greek finds did not actually reach the Black Sea region until sometime in the 3rd quarter of the 7th century BC. The south and east of the Black Sea were almost completely excluded from this contact. Contrary to earlier assumptions, the finds on the coast appear to be from roughly the same phase as those found further inland. We do not want to argue about a Descartes here, which the existing rough chronology of Eastern Greek pottery does not allow anyway. Early attempts by Gottschalk-Zetzklaze and Ala-Buiskich had already tried to demonstrate this harmonization of finds in the hinterland and on the coast. However, I would now like to agree more and more with the position of Ala, who also took the right direction in her work based on the early pottery she published from Berezan and other sites. In addition, I hope to have demonstrated that there is probably no need for a chronological sequence and division into Western and Northern Pontus and the Asian side of the Azov Sea. The Greek finds reached the coast and the hinterland almost simultaneously. both in indigenous settlements, kurgans, and also in places where later successful or lesser successful Greek settlements were established. Again, we do not want to argue about a decade or so. Thirdly, there are small time differences. The finds in Nemirov are perhaps somewhat older than those in Novozavedonoi. But we are not talking about a generation here. But I do not want to prevent you from having a small glimpse of what might actually have happened a generation later, based on the dating of the oldest finds that we have now discussed. But I do, in Poland, near the border with Ukraine, a large number of Greek amphora from the late 7th, early 6th century BC was again found in an indigenous settlement in Kotiniec. What makes these finds so significant is that it crossed the watershed. It therefore appears that the river system leading to the Baltic and Northern Sea will be reached about a generation later. Perhaps this discovery will also lead to new considerations regarding the finds from Vettersfelde, for example. You see here the place of the finds, and here the watershed. Dniester is going down to the Black Sea, and the sun already finds its way to the system to the north. And here too, a similar case can be cited for the east. Once again, a kurgan of indigenous elites includes a stylistic older amphora, probably of North Ionian production, or perhaps of colonial manufacture, perhaps from the Hellespont. It is now located exactly where the Don comes with a few kilometers off to the Volga. The Greek table amphora ended up at this very crossing after a long journey, and certainly across the river again. As mentioned, this seems to have happened about a generation after the first expansion. This may show that the Greeks' network from the Black Sea were integrated into other networks of other river systems at this time. So I will not end up here without showing you two more slides. And they're dealing with Etruscan finds, with Bucero finds, which were found in Histria, Berezan, and Taganrog. And I mentioned them here because they also belong to the horizon of the 7th century, even if they are belonging to the very end of the 7th century. But I guess with these finds, we do not have any big problems because they for sure were carried by the Greeks, the Ionian Greeks. Example of these Cantoroi and other forms were found in a mass in the Heraion of Samos and also in the sanctuary of Miletos. But with my last slide, we come to another problem, which really is a problem. And these are Phrygian finds, which were found in Histria, in Berezan, and in Pantikapayon only. And again, this pottery has to be dated in the end of the 7th, maybe in the early beginning of the 6th century BC. And they are really isolated, and they have no contact to the normal roots of the Greeks. And with this picture and with this problem, which is maybe a good start for a discussion, I will end up here. Thank you very much.